If you've been following the recent developments in Venezuela, you've probably seen a video by viral YouTube comedian Joanna Hausman.
A lot of people are talking about the complicated situation in my home country, and
in this video, Hausman says she's fed up with disinformation about Venezuela spreading online, and she's gonna set the record straight. The points she makes are all generic, mainstream talking points, and upon further investigation, her arguments don't really stand up. An important thing to note about Joanna Hausman is that she's not just some random YouTuber, she's actually the daughter of Ricardo Hausman, who was a member of the board of the Central Bank of Venezuela, and at this time he also served as the chair of the IMF World Bank Development Committee, and he was responsible for a lot of the neoliberal policies that brought about the massive inflation in the 80s and 90s, and these policies were ultimately what the majority of Venezuelans rejected in voting in Hugo Chavez. And since coming to America, since leaving Venezuela, he has written numerous articles calling for regime change in Venezuela, saying that that's the only solution, and a lot of Joanna's talking points are even taken from some of his articles. Hausman's argument goes as follows.
1. What is happening in Venezuela is not a US-backed coup. 2. This is not a fight between the Venezuelan right wing and the Venezuelan left wing. 3. The people of Venezuela are seeking fair, democratic elections using the laws written in our Constitution. 4. Juan Guaido did not just declare himself president out of nowhere.
Hausman makes Guaido out to be the face of the opposition movement and a major player in the country's National Assembly.
Juan Guaido is not a right-wing politician, but the son of a taxi driver and a liberal representative in Congress. Guaido was elected by the Venezuelan people to be a representative in Venezuela's National Assembly.
But he's actually a pretty minor politician. Guaido represents the Venezuelan state of Vargas, which is one of the least populous states in the country. Within that state, he only came in second place in the 2015 parliamentary elections, winning 26% of votes cast to secure his spot in the National Assembly. And he wasn't elected to be head of the National Assembly. The seat is on a rotation, and he just happened to be in that seat. He was never voted on in a democratic election to be president of Venezuela. Not to mention, he'd have a difficult time in the presidential elections. A recent poll found that over 80% of Venezuelans don't even know who Guaido is. Guaido owes his recently acquired celebrity status solely to the Trump administration's decision to recognize him as the president of Venezuela. Major opposition figure Enrique Capriles even conceded that move, quote, surprised a lot of political figures. Juan Guaido is undeniably right-wing. His plan is to privatize social programs like the Great Venezuelan Housing Mission, a public housing construction project considered one of the great achievements of the Bolivarian Revolution. According to Reuters, Guaido also plans to privatize state oil companies, whose profits have been used to fund social programs like healthcare and schools. Guaido and the opposition-held National Assembly have been attempting to privatize these programs for years. It recently passed the so-called transition law, which states, public companies will be subject to a restructuring process that ensures their efficient and transparent management, including through public-private agreements.
He is acting as interim president, as in temporary president, until democratic elections can be ensured, which is, by the way, dictated by law in the Constitution when a president is deemed illegitimate.
Hausman is referring to Article 233 of the Venezuelan Constitution, which several opposition figures have cited as proof that Guaido is the lawful president of Venezuela. A closer reading of Article 233 shows it only applies if the president is mentally or physically incapable of holding office, has resigned, died, abandons his position, or is deemed illegitimate by the National Assembly. Hausman claims Maduro has been ruled unfit to serve by the Assembly. Furthermore, Guaido announced his plans to assume the presidency on January 11th. The National Assembly only declared Maduro unfit to serve days later on January 15th. These dates are crucial as Article 233 clearly states, quote, when an elected president becomes permanently unavailable to serve prior to his inauguration, a new election by universal suffrage and direct ballot shall be held within 30 consecutive days. Pending election and inauguration of the new president, the President of the National Assembly shall take charge of the presidency of the Republic. Maduro was sworn in to serve his second term as president on January 10th, meaning all of this happened after his inauguration, in which case, according to the law, the executive vice president, Delcy Rodriguez, would take over. You don't need a degree in Venezuelan law to see how Hausman and the opposition's case for constitutionality is extremely fragile. But let's at least hear why she thinks Maduro is illegitimate.
In 2017, the Supreme Court that was hand-picked by Nicolás Maduro's party nullified and stripped the National Assembly, or Congress, of their powers. The National Assembly was chosen by vote.
To say that the Supreme Court nullified the National Assembly or that the Supreme Court dissolved it is categorically false. In reality, in 2017, the Supreme Court placed the body in a state of contempt after an investigation found that 4 representatives, 1 pro-government, were engaged in vote buying. While the pro-government legislator complied with the court's demands, the opposition refused. Venezuela Analysis explains, quote, "Despite inaccurate reports from the likes of CNN, the move does not mean that Parliament has been dissolved. As it stands, the National Assembly still exists, but remains in a state of contempt of the judicial system. Theoretically, it can rectify the situation by removing the lawmakers accused of electoral fraud and continue to legislate."
Imagine when the Democrats took the House, if Trump was like, no, I don't like this anymore. The House is no longer a legitimate part of government, and here's another House that I made up with everyone that agrees with me.
But Maduro didn't make up the Constituent Assembly, the Venezuelan Constitution did. Article 347 says, quote, "The original constituent power rests with the people of Venezuela. This power may be exercised by calling a national constituent assembly for the purpose of transforming the state, creating a new judicial order, and drawing up a new constitution." A more analogous comparison would be if the US Constitution contained a clause that would allow it to be revised. Imagine if we here in the States could elect a new constituent assembly to override a filibuster, partisan gridlock, or unseat politicians elected through gerrymandering and vote suppression schemes.
Venezuela erupted in protests. Hundreds of protesters, most of them teenagers, were detained, some of whom were tortured and murdered.
Venezuela did not simply erupt into protest. Opposition leaders called for violent street protests following the Constituent Assembly elections. Opposition protesters have thrown Molotov cocktails at government vehicles and burned alive Afro-Venezuelans they suspected of being Chavistas. One group even took up arms, stealing a government helicopter in order to shoot at and drop grenades on the Supreme Court. Their goal is to incite a response from police in order to cultivate a narrative that the government is violently suppressing dissent.
Fast forward to May 20th, 2018, where this illegitimate Congress calls for presidential elections. Now, during these elections, the most popular opposition candidates are either jailed, exiled, or banned from running. In other words, there is no legitimate way for the opposition to run.
Here, Houseman is leaving out a huge part of the story. The opposition boycotted not only the 2017 Constituent Assembly elections, but also the 2018 presidential elections. They were not banned. Yet media reports often claim Maduro banned the opposition from running. And while Maduro did state in 2017, quote, "A party that has not participated today and has called for the boycott of elections can't participate anymore," that's because Venezuelan electoral law states the registration of political parties will be canceled if they have failed to participate in elections for 2 consecutive constitutional terms. The opposition's strategy is to boycott the elections to create the illusion of a one-party dictatorship. The US supports this strategy, evidenced by the fact that the Trump administration actually threatened to sanction opposition candidate Henry Falcone for participating in the elections. This begs the question, if the elections were as fraudulent and undemocratic as Washington claims, why are they going to such lengths to undermine them?
So these sham presidential elections are held anyway by Maduro's government, where only 20% of the population voted.
To back this assertion, Houseman cites one poll, which happens to be the lowest estimate of voter turnout. The government, meanwhile, recorded 9 million Venezuelans who voted in the election, which is equal to 46% of the country. The Maduro government went as far as to invite 150 international observers to oversee the elections, and those observers stressed that everything went perfectly normally. In 2012, former US President Jimmy Carter even said Venezuela's elections were the best in the world after observing elections in 92 countries.
Maduro took the minimum wage from $350 a month to $7 a month. Meanwhile, inflation hit 1.7 million% in 2018, with the IMF projecting 10 million% in 2019. So the daily minimum wage can't buy 2 eggs.
The claim that Maduro lowered the minimum wage so drastically is mind-boggling. There is no conceivable reason why Maduro would benefit from doing this. Regardless, it's not even true. Maduro has increased the minimum wage several times during his presidency. Once in January of 2014, another time in July of 2017, and most recently, January of 2019. Houseman is probably referring to inflation, which can drive down the purchasing power of those wages. Before 2015, inflation in Venezuela was lower than it was in the 80s and 90s, the period before the Bolivarian Revolution. Inflation spiked in 2015 when Barack Obama imposed financial sanctions on Venezuela, preventing it from accessing funds stored in American banks. Inflation has continued to rise as further financial sanctions have prevented Venezuelans from accessing loans, foreign investment, and even its own gold. Furthermore, at the Colombian border, Colombian crime syndicates facilitate black market currency exchanges, which offer Venezuelans 6 times more bolivar per US dollar than the government currency exchanges. This creates an external inflationary pressure on the bolivar because it floods Venezuela with bolivar and sucks out all of the dollars. The sanctions and currency exchanges are intentional policies aimed at devaluing the bolivar. The economic crisis is real, but it's a consequence of an economic war waged by Washington and its Latin American allies. If you're still not convinced that this is a US-led war, consider that the first aid shipment sent to Venezuela was intercepted by Venezuelan authorities because it was filled with assault rifles and ammunition.
There is such a shortage of medical supplies that people are dying from previously eradicated diseases like polio because there aren't any vaccines.
Again, this is a consequence of the economic sanctions that have prevented Venezuela from acquiring the necessary foreign reserves it needs to import medicine. To blame the Venezuelan government for the consequences of US sanctions is to blame the victims.
The media in Venezuela who should be reporting on this shit is censored and dissidents are jailed. Over 5,000 people since 2014 have been detained for speaking out against the government. And just since last week, when Guaidó was elected, 791 people have been jailed.
The Venezuelan government does not censor opposition media. Journalist Abby Martin from the Empire Files went to Venezuela to expose this myth.
When I was walking around Caracas, I was surprised to see many adversarial, pro-opposition publications being sold at newsstands.
That's all I've got for you today, but on a separate note from Joanna's video, I want to point out that this conversation has really strayed from the root of Venezuela's problems, which is that the United States is constantly trying to play the role of world police. The reason Venezuela finds itself in the situation it's in today is because the US is actively backing an opposition movement and sabotaging the country in order to put in power a government that serves Washington's interests. It's the same thing our government's been doing for decades in places like Korea, Iran, Guatemala, South Africa, and Palestine, everywhere. We can't pretend like there's something different about Venezuela, especially when John Bolton goes on TV and nonchalantly says that regime change in Venezuela will be beneficial for US oil companies.
Tyranny, it'll make a big difference to the United States economically if we could have American oil companies really invest in and produce the oil.
They're lying to us about Venezuela just like they lied to us about Syria, Libya, Iraq, Vietnam, and Korea. We're being manipulated by war propaganda disguised as humanitarianism. If the Pentagon really cared about poverty and hunger, the Defense Department budget should be spent alleviating poverty in this country, which affects 40 million Americans, ending homelessness and malnutrition. Until we solve these problems in this country, we just look arrogant criticizing Venezuelans, 86% of whom oppose US intervention.